Hello and welcome to this channel. Today we are going to look at the life of one of South Africa's most famous presidents. He was in office for just 4 years, but made great changes during his time, and he didn't stop fighting for what he believed in until he was 93 years old. So let's find out more about Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in a village called Mvizo in South Africa. His father was a chief, but sadly he died when Nelson was only 9 years old. Nelson then moved to live with his uncle, who was a military leader. He hoped that his cousin would follow in his footsteps and become a great warrior. But Nelson wasn't interested in this. He wanted to be a lawyer. When he finished school, he went to university and studied law. After graduating, he moved to Johannesburg, where he started his own law firm. It wasn't long before he became a successful lawyer. But he soon realized that there was a much bigger problem than not having any clients. Black people in South Africa weren't allowed to vote. They were unallowed to own land or businesses. And they could not even travel freely around their own country. This was all because of the color of their skin. The white minority government had passed laws which enforced racial segregation. This meant that black people were treated like second-class citizens. After seeing this injustice, Nelson decided to join a political party called the African National Congress, or the ANC. Here he met people who shared the same dream, to end racial segregation and create a free South Africa where everyone was equal. Nelson helped to form a group within the ANC, whose aim was to use non-violent resistance to fight against the government. This meant that instead of using violence and weapons, they would try to persuade the government to change its laws by peacefully protesting. In 1962, Nelson was arrested for planning to overthrow the government. Even though he hadn't actually done anything violent, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. After serving his sentence, he was supposed to be released. But when the government heard that he was planning to continue his protests, they changed their mind and decided to keep him in prison indefinitely. For the next 27 years, Nelson was moved from one prison to another. Sometimes he was allowed to see his family, but most of the time he spent in solitary confinement, which means he was kept completely alone. This was meant to break him and make him give up, but it didn't. In fact, it did quite the opposite. People all over the world started to hear about Nelson Mandela and what he had done. They began to protest against the South African government, asking them to release Nelson. In 1989, after 27 years, the government finally agreed to release Nelson from prison. It felt like a miracle. Everyone was so happy. Millions of people came onto the streets to celebrate. The day he walked out of prison, they played the song "Free Nelson Mandela" by the Specials. At this point, Nelson was already too old to take over the ANC and become president. But he continued to work with the party and eventually became the first president of South Africa in 1994. Even though he was now the leader of the country, he didn't take revenge on those who had put him in prison. Instead, he showed them forgiveness and worked towards uniting the country and giving everyone equality. Unfortunately, Nelson suffered greatly for his beliefs, and many members of his family also suffered. One of his sons died in a car crash while he was in prison, and his daughter passed away from cancer, and he never got to see either of them. His wife Winnie also had a very hard time. She was often arrested and beaten by the police, and she lost her life shortly after Nelson was freed from prison. But, despite all this sadness, Nelson remained strong and continued working for peace. Just 2 years after becoming president, he helped to create a new constitution for South Africa. This constitution made it illegal to discriminate against someone because of their race, and it gave everyone equal rights. He also created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to help people who had suffered under the old regime. Sadly, there were some people who did unwant change, and they still wanted to keep black people as second-class citizens. These people were called Afrikaners, and they had been in power for so long that they didn't know how to act when they were no longer in charge. Some of them even planned to assassinate Nelson Mandela, but every time they came close, something happened to stop them. First, the judge who was going to sentence one of the assassins passed away suddenly. Then the weapon that the next assassin was going to use broke at the last moment, and when the third assassin was ready to pull the trigger, his gun jammed. It seemed like fate was protecting Nelson Mandela. After 4 years as president, Nelson stepped down and retired from public life. But he didn't spend much time relaxing. He continued to work with his charity, the Nelson Mandela Foundation, which works to promote peace and human rights around the world. So why do we remember Nelson Mandela today? Well, he is a true inspiration. He dedicated his whole life to fighting for freedom and equality, not just for himself, but for everyone. He was willing to go to prison for his beliefs and even put his life on the line to achieve peace. Nelson Mandela Day is celebrated on July each year, his birthday. This is a day for people around the world to come together and try to make the world a better place, just like Nelson. One of the ways we can honor Nelson Mandela's memory is by educating ourselves about the terrible system of racial segregation called apartheid. Apartheid was created by the white minority government in South Africa and lasted for over 20 years. During this time, black people were treated like they were less than human. They were forced to live in separate areas, away from white people. They couldn't vote or own businesses, and if they were caught breaking any of the laws, they could be put in prison without a trial. There were even special police, called the Voorwaarts Task Force, whose job it was to kidnap and murder activists like Steve Biko. Luckily, people like Nelson Mandela didn't give up until apartheid was finally abolished. If you want to learn more about Nelson Mandela, I highly recommend watching the movie Invictus, starring Morgan Freeman. It is an amazing film based on true events and will give you a deeper understanding of what it was like living in South Africa during apartheid. Thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, please click the thumbs up button. I'll see you next time.